Kang Sang-ho set the manila envelope on the table like it was nothing. Like it was a grocery receipt. Like the contents hadn't taken him 3 years to assemble. Inside were medical records. Falsified. Expertly done. His nephew, Kang Tae-jun, the most feared man on the East Coast, had spent the last decade believing he could never father a child. Believing his bloodline ended with him. Believing the doctors who told him so. Those doctors worked for Xiong-ho. The old man picked up his tea, took a slow sip, and allowed himself one small smile. He had already won. He just didn't know yet that the woman his nephew had married, to satisfy tradition, a curvy black girl from an antique shop in Englewood, New Jersey, had been quietly reading his mail. If someone spent years stealing your future before you even knew you had one, what would you do when you finally found out? Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the very end, because what happens next will shake you. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The night Amara Ellison's life changed, it was raining so hard she couldn't hear herself think. She was in the back of the shop, on her knees, using a heat gun on a warped mahogany writing desk that a woman in Montclair had dropped off 3 weeks ago with a note that said, "Please, it was my mother's." Amara had been staring at that desk for 2 days before she figured out the problem. The grain was fighting her. She had to work with it, not against it. That was something her father used to say. Work with the grain, not against it. She missed him every single day. The bell above the shop door rang, which meant her aunt had forgotten to lock up again. Amara peeled off her work gloves and stood, pressing one hand against her lower back. She was 28 years old and already sounded like a woman twice that age when she got up from a crouch. "Auntie D, I'm almost done with the Harrington piece," she called out. "I just need another 20 minutes. Nobody answered. Amara came around the corner of the display room and stopped. 3 men in dark suits were standing inside the shop. Behind them, rain hammered the front windows. One of the men was holding an umbrella that he hadn't bothered to close. Water was pooling on the hardwood floor. Amara had refinished herself. She almost said something about the floor. Then she saw the 4th man. He was standing slightly apart from the others, closer to the glass display case near the register. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a small ceramic lamp on the second shelf, the one Amara had repainted and rewired herself because a 6-year-old in the family had knocked it off a shelf and the mother had cried. He was Korean-American, mid-30s, with a face that belonged on the cover of something expensive. His suit was charcoal, and it fit him the way expensive things fit powerful people, like it had been made flow follow his body instead of the other way around. His hands were in his pockets. His expression was completely still. He looked like a man who had learned very early in life that showing emotion was the same as showing weakness. Amara had met exactly one person like that before, her father in the last year of his life, when the illness had taken everything except his pride. She did not say anything about the floor. "Miss Ellison." His voice was even. Not threatening, not warm. Just precise like a man reading coordinates. "Is your aunt home?" Amara didn't move. "Who's asking?" He looked at her then. Dark eyes, completely steady. Not aggressive, not particularly interested. The kind of look that made you feel like you'd already been assessed and filed. "My name is Kang Tae-jun." Behind her, from the apartment stairwell, she heard her aunt's voice. "Amara." Just that. One word, but the sound of it, flattened, stripped of everything, made the hair on Amara's arms stand up. Denise Ellison came down the last 2 steps and into the room, and Amara looked at her face and understood immediately that whatever was happening, her aunt had been expecting it. She just hadn't expected it yet. They sat at the back table, Amara and Denise on one side, Tae-jun on the other, his men stationed near the door like furniture that breathed. The overhead light was the same cheap fluorescent Amara had been meaning to replace for a year. It buzzed faintly. Nobody acknowledged it. Tae-jun placed a single document on the table and slid it across. Denise's hands were folded in her lap. She didn't reach for it. "You've had 4 years, Tae-jun said, not unkind. Not kind either. The original principle was manageable. The compounded interest is not." Amara looked at her aunt. Denise was 61 years old. She had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and kept this shop alive through a pandemic, a recession, and a flood that took out the basement storage. She did not break easily. Amara had never once seen her break. Denise was not breaking now, exactly, but she was close. Close enough that Amara could see the effort it was costing her to sit still. "How much?" Amara said. Tae-jun looked at her, not surprised. "Just recalibrating. The number on that paper." Amara reached across and picked up the document. She looked at it. Then she set it down carefully because her hands had started to shake and she didn't want anyone in this room to see that. The number was not a number she could fix. The number was not a number Denise could fix. The number was the kind of number that meant the shop was gone, the apartment above it was gone, and the last thing her parents had ever connected her to this stubborn, drafty, beautiful little business was gone too. 7 days, Tae-jun said. Arrangements can be made for a payment schedule, but the interest will continue to accrue. What kind of arrangements? Amara said. Her aunt made a small sound. Barely anything. But Amara heard it, Denise. Amara turned. What kind of arrangements? The fluorescent light buzzed. Rain hit the window. Denise unfolded her hands and put them flat on the table like she was steadying herself against something. There's another option, her aunt said. I was told before tonight that there might be another option. Tae-jun said nothing. He simply waited, and Denise told Amara what it was. Amara didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen above the shop with a cup of tea that went cold at her elbow, and she thought about her parents. Her father, Marcus, who used to whistle while he cooked, and never once in her memory raised his voice. Her mother, Gloria, who wore her natural hair in a giant bun and argued with everyone, and loved harder than any person Amara had ever known. They had both been gone 3 years. Car accident, 2 weeks apart from each other, one from the crash, one from the grief that the doctors labeled pneumonia, but Amara knew better. She had packed up their house alone, moved herself to Englewood to help Denise, because Denise was the only family she had left. What Denise had told her was this. Kang Tae-jun's position inside the Korean-American crime family he controlled had been quietly destabilizing for years. He was feared by rivals, respected by his people. But a medical diagnosis delivered some years back, the details of which Denise hadn't known entirely, had created a succession crisis. Tae-jun had no heir. His extended family, led primarily by his uncle Seong-ho, had begun positioning for what came after. A marriage, properly arranged, to a woman who would serve as his wife in every visible sense, would reinforce his standing. Give the family something to settle around. Buy time. The debt would disappear completely. Amara sat with that for a long time. She was being asked to marry a man she had met 90 minutes ago. A man who ran a criminal organization. A man who could not, according to doctors, father a child, which meant this marriage would be performance without the possibility of permanence. She was being asked to trade herself for a shop, for her aunt, for the last thing connecting her to everyone she'd lost. She picked up the cold tea, looked at it, and put it back down. Work with the grain. At 6 in the morning, she went downstairs and told Denise yes. The wedding was small and cold and efficient. A civil ceremony at a downtown office, witnesses who were strangers, flowers that someone on Tae-jun's staff had ordered without asking what Amara liked. She wore a cream dress she'd bought herself from a boutique in Hoboken because nobody offered to help her choose one. She did her own hair, pinned her curls up in the back, and wore her mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry from that box she'd kept. Tae-jun wore a dark suit and said his part of the ceremony without inflection, as if reading a legal contract, which Amara supposed this was. His uncle Seong-ho attended, gray-haired, soft-spoken, with an old man's careful smile. He shook off Amara's hand and told her she was lovely, and something about the way he said it, the particular quality of his approval. Like he was noting a property acquisition, made her skin crawl slightly. She didn't mention it. There was no celebration, no dancing. No one asked if she was happy. At 9 that evening, a car brought her to the estate. It was enormous. That was her first thought, not beautiful, not impressive, just enormous. 5 floors of glass and stone on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, the kind of house designed to communicate that the person inside could not be reached. Tae-jun led her through the front entrance and up a staircase that had enough square footage for the entire first floor of her parents' old house. A woman named Mrs. Park, the estate's head of household, showed Amara to a suite on the third floor. Her bags had already been unpacked. Her clothes were hung in a closet the size of her old bedroom. Mrs. Park left. Tae-jun stood in the doorway. Amara sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room and thought, "This is my life now." The feeling was so strange and complete that she almost laughed. "I want to be clear about something," Tae-jun said. She looked at him. He was still in his wedding suit. He'd taken off the jacket. He stood with one shoulder against the doorframe, and for a moment, just a moment, he didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who had practiced what he wanted to say and was hoping the words still fit. "This arrangement is legal and it is visible," he said. "What it is not is a claim on you. You are not required to share my bedroom. You are not required to play a role inside this house that you didn't agree to. The marriage exists for external purposes. Inside these walls, you are not my performance." Amara looked at him for a long time. "You rehearsed that," she said. Something flickered in his expression. Not offense. Not amusement. Somewhere between. "I wanted to be precise," he said. "You were." She looked at her hands. Her mother's pearls were still in her ears. "I'm going to hold you to that. Every word. I expect you to." He left. She sat in that room for a while, listening to the enormous house be quiet around her, and then she did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She cried, not for long, not loud, but completely. When she was done, she washed her face, changed her clothes, and went looking for the kitchen. She found it after 2 wrong turns and a pantry that was larger than the shop's back room. The kitchen was stainless and cold and perfectly organized. Every surface was clean. The refrigerator was stocked with things like sparkling water, prepared containers of food she didn't recognize, and nothing that suggested anyone actually cooked here. Amara opened the spice cabinet. It was almost entirely empty. Salt, black pepper, something labeled in Korean. She stared at that cabinet for a solid 30 seconds. Then she closed it and went looking for the shopping list she was going to have to make, because if she was going to live in this house, she was going to need actual food. She found a notepad near the house phone, a real landline phones, which surprised her, and she started writing. That was where Tae-jun found her at 11:30 at night, standing at the kitchen island in bare feet and a sleeve shirt, writing a grocery list by hand. He was in a different suit. She wondered briefly if he owned anything else. "There is a chef," he said. "I cook," she said, without looking up. "You don't have to." "I know." She kept writing. "Red onion. Cornmeal. Collard greens. Do you have a food processor?" A pause. "I don't know." She looked up. "You don't know what's in your own kitchen?" "I don't use the kitchen." Amara looked at him. Then at the pristine, sterile, expensive kitchen. Then back at him. "What do you eat?" "Whatever is prepared for me." She thought about that. She wrote food processor on the list, with an asterisk and underline. "You're going to eat actual food now," she said. "You're not allergic to anything?" "Not that I know of." "Good." She capped the pen. "And you should know I will not be eating in my room, or after everyone else, or quietly in a corner somewhere. If this house has a dining room, I'm using it." He looked at her with that steady, assessing expression. "It has a dining room. Then we're eating together. Starting tomorrow," she picked up the notepad. "You don't have to talk. But you're going to sit at the same table." The house was quiet. Tae-jun didn't argue. "Fine," he said. He turned to leave. "Tae-jun." He stopped. "Thank you," Amara said, "for what you said upstairs. About not being a performance." She didn't look at him directly. "You didn't have to say that." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than it had been all night. "I didn't want you to be afraid here." She nodded once. He left. She stood in the kitchen alone, holding her grocery list, and thought, well, that is something. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. The first 2 weeks were like living in a museum someone had forgotten was a house. Amara came from rooms with personality. Her parents' home had been layered with 20 years of accumulated living, crocheted blankets, framed photos, stacks of books with cracked spines, and her mother's inexplicable collection of ceramic roosters covering the top of the refrigerator. Denise's apartment above the shop smelled like lemon oil and old wood, and the particular candle Denise burned on Sunday mornings. The Kang estate smelled like nothing. It was climate-controlled, professionally maintained. Every surface was chosen for appearance rather than comfort, and nobody seemed to have noticed or cared. Amara noticed. She started small. She opened the curtains in the east-facing sitting room that Mrs. Park said nobody used, because the light was extraordinary in the mornings, and it was criminal to waste it. She moved a stiff decorative chair from the front hallway into the sitting room and put a small lamp beside it and a stack of her own books on the side table, and for 2 days she sat in that chair with her coffee every morning and felt slightly more like a person. Then she rearranged the kitchen island so there was actual working space rather than a display surface. Mrs. Park watched her do it with an expression somewhere between alarm and fascination. "Mr. Kang hasn't mentioned any changes," Mrs. Park said carefully. "Then I'll mention them," Amara said. She moved a block of decorative wood, not a cutting board, just wood, doing nothing off the island, and into a cabinet. "Do you know where the actual cutting boards are?" They found them in a lower cabinet that clearly hadn't been opened in months. Amara cooked a full dinner that first Sunday. Cornbread, slow-cooked collard greens with smoked turkey, baked chicken thighs with a pan sauce, roasted sweet potatoes. She didn't cook for an audience. She cooked because it was the thing she knew how to do when she didn't know what else to do. When she set it out in the dining room at 6 in the evening, Mrs. Park stared at the table like she was seeing a different room. "Mr. Kang usually has dinner at 7:30, she said. "Then he'll eat it at 7:30, Amara said. "It reheats fine." He came home at 7:15. He walked into the dining room, stopped, and looked at the table. Something crossed his face very quickly and then left. He sat down. He ate the cornbread first, in the careful way of someone who didn't know the protocol and was treating the unfamiliar food with appropriate respect. Then the greens, then the chicken. He ate almost everything on his plate. Amara watched him eat the way you watch someone try a thing they've never tried before, and there was something almost funny about it. This man, who controlled a criminal empire, handling a piece of cornbread like it might have rules. "Is it all right?" she asked. He looked up. "It's very good," he said, and he meant it simply, without elaboration, and Amara thought, okay. This one doesn't know how to receive things. "You can say if something isn't," she said. "I'm not precious about cooking." "It's good," he said again. They ate mostly in silence, but they ate together. The onion situation happened on a Wednesday. Tae-jun had been coming home earlier, not dramatically earlier, not in any way he acknowledged, but Amara noticed. 7:15 became 7. 7 became 6:45. She didn't say anything about it. She was making a sofrito base for a rice dish when he came into the kitchen, loosening his tie, and she turned around and handed him a knife and said, "Chop that onion for me." Rough pieces. He looked at the knife. He looked at the onion. He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to perform surgery," she said. "Just cut it into chunks." He took the knife. What followed was a genuinely impressive failure. Tae-jun Kang, who coordinated multi-million-dollar criminal operations across 6 states, could not figure out the best approach to a yellow onion. He started from the wrong end. He abandoned that, tried the other end. The onion rolled. He stabilized it with one hand with far more force than necessary, as if it might escape. Amara watched him for 45 seconds, pressing her lips together. She was losing. A laugh came out of her that she did not plan, sharp and genuine, the kind that bends you at the waist a little. Tae-jun stopped and looked at her. "The onion is winning," she managed. He looked at the onion. Then, slowly, with the particular dignity of a man deciding not to be embarrassed, "Show me how, then." She showed him. She stood beside him and moved his hands into the right position, flat palm on top, fingers curled back, and walked him through the technique. He was a fast study. By the 3rd cut, he had it. By the 5th cut, he was doing it properly. He didn't say anything when he finished, but when Amara looked at him sideways, the absolute steel of his usual expression had shifted, barely just enough to show something underneath it. Something that might have been in a different man. The smile. Don't get confident, she said. I'm going to make you do the garlic next. The garlic is smaller, he said. Exactly. He stayed in the kitchen while she cooked. Not helping, at first. Just existing in the same space, which was its own kind of thing. By the time dinner was done, he'd minced the garlic. Badly. Better than the onion. They ate at the dining room table. Amara told him about a chair she'd once found in a storage unit in Patterson that turned out to be a Biedermeier piece, worth $4,000. He listened without interrupting, which she was coming to understand was just how he listened, complete attention, no performance of interest. He told her briefly about a shipping contract that had gone sideways. Nothing specific, nothing she could use or understand in context. Just a problem, a decision, a resolution that had cost him 3 days and required him to fly to Baltimore at 2 in the morning. Did it work out, she asked. Well enough, he said. You don't like to say, when things go well, do you? He considered that. It's not useful to celebrate before the next problem. Amara put her fork down and looked at him. That is the saddest thing I've ever heard anyone say at a dinner table. He looked genuinely uncertain how to respond to that. You can be glad something worked, she said. That's allowed. He looked at her for a moment. In my experience, satisfaction creates complacency. In my experience, she said, picking her fork back up, people who refuse to feel good about anything eventually forget what good feels like. He didn't answer, but he finished his dinner slowly, and he didn't leave the table until she did. The incident with the household employee happened 6 weeks after the wedding. Tae-jun had come back from a meeting that had clearly gone wrong. She could tell by the way he moved. When he came through the door, shoulders tight, steps precise. Everything controlled in the way things get controlled when they're fighting not to break loose. One of the younger household staff, a man named Jin-ho who was 24 and had been with the estate for 8 months, had made a mistake with a delivery wrong time, wrong entrance, some logistical error that cascaded into a complication at an hour. Tae-jun did not have patience for complications. Amara was in the sitting room. She heard Tae-jun's voice from the entryway, not loud, not out of control, but with a particular quality that made your stomach drop. The specific register of someone powerful, choosing every word to land like something physical. She heard Jin-ho's silence. That silence was the thing that moved her. She set down her book, got up, walked through to the entryway. Tae-jun registered her arrival in his peripheral vision and stopped. Jin-ho stood with his eyes down, face tight. He was 24 years old, and he looked like he was trying very hard not to look like he was about to disappear. Amara looked at Tae-jun. She didn't say anything yet. She turned to Jin-ho. You're done for the night, she said simply. Thank you. Jin-ho looked between them. Then he nodded and left. Amara watched Tae-jun. He was watching her. His expression had shifted from whatever it was during the dressing down to something more guarded. I'm going to say something, she said, and you can be angry about it if you need to. But you're going to listen first. His jaw tightened. Amara, you scared him, she said, not because you were firm, because you wanted to. And those are different things. Silence. Fear gets you obedience, she continued. You know that better than anyone, but it doesn't get you loyalty. It doesn't get you someone who tells you the truth when the truth is bad. It gets you people who hide problems from you until the problems are catastrophic because they're more afraid of you than of the consequences. She watched him. He was very still. I've seen men lead with fear my entire life, she said. My father wasn't one of them. The people who loved him would have done anything for him. The people who worked for the ones who used fear. She shook her head. First chance they got, something moved behind Tae-jun's eyes. Hard to name, not rage, not dismissal. He turned and walked toward his study. Amara thought, well, I probably just broke something. At 10 o'clock that night, there was a knock on her sitting room door. Tae-jun stood in the doorway. He had changed out of his suit. For the first time since she'd known him, he was in something ordinary dark pants, a simple long-sleeved shirt. He looked somehow younger and considerably less armored. I spoke to Jin-ho, he said. She waited. I told him the error was manageable and that he should come to me directly if there are logistical conflicts in the future. A pause. And that tonight was that I handled it poorly. Amara let that sit for a moment. That wasn't easy for you, she said. No, you still did it. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Stripped back. Honest, you were right, he said. Simply. No elaboration. Amara nodded once. Good night, Tae-jun. He said good night. He left. She sat in her chair by the open curtains and watched the Hudson River catch the light from the opposite bank, and she thought, there's a real person in there, buried under years of armor and calculation and the particular loneliness of men who learned too young that needing things made them a target. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she knew she'd seen it now. And seeing it made it very hard to pretend it wasn't there. 3 months into the marriage, Amara stopped thinking of the estate as a place she was staying and started thinking of it as a place she lived. The distinction mattered more than she expected. She knew which floorboards creaked on the second-floor landing. She knew that Mrs. Park took her lunch at exactly 12:15 and was irritable for 20 minutes before it. She knew that the East Garden got too much afternoon glare to sit in after 2 o'clock but was extraordinary at dawn, and she'd started taking her coffee out there in the mornings before anyone else was up. She knew that Tae-jun's security lead, a compact and relentlessly serious man named Cho, communicated almost exclusively in variations of silence, the kind that meant this is fine, the kind that meant I have concerns, and the kind that meant please stop doing that immediately. She was getting better at reading which was which. What she hadn't expected was how much of Tae-jun's world would start coming to find her. It began with a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear. She was in the East Garden at 6:40, in the morning coffee going cold in her hand, the way it always did when she started actually watching the river instead of drinking. The study window above was open. Tae-jun kept it open regardless of season. Something she'd noticed, and his voice came down clear in the still air. Not the words. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone. She had learned Tae-jun's tones the way you learn the weather, in a place you live not by studying it, just by being in it long enough. There was his meeting voice, which was even and precise and gave away nothing. There was the voice he used with Mrs. Park and the household staff, which was direct but not unkind. There was the voice he occasionally used with her, in the evenings mostly, which was quieter and moved slower, like a man who'd stopped checking the clock. This was none of those. This was compressed, careful in a way that meant the carefulness itself was the message. She didn't move. She sat in the garden chair with her cold coffee and listened to the quality of it and felt something shift low in her gut. Not fear exactly, but its neighbor. At breakfast, Tae-jun came to the table, already dressed, already somewhere else behind his eyes. You're going to Manhattan, Amara said. He looked at her. You're wearing the gray tie. She poured herself more coffee. You wear the gray tie when you have a meeting you're not sure about. He was quiet for a moment. I wear the gray tie frequently. You wear the dark blue one when you're comfortable. The charcoal when it's routine. The gray one when something's off. She sat down. I could be wrong. He looked at her across the table. You're not wrong. She nodded, picked up her fork. Will you be back for dinner? Unlikely. I'll leave something. He left at 7:15 and Amara sat at the big dining room table alone and ate her eggs and thought about the phone call she hadn't been able to hear and the particular quality of his voice during it and the way he'd looked at her just now, not guarded exactly, but careful, like a man deciding what to carry and what to set down. She thought about it more than she probably should have. The first real fight happened 2 weeks later. It started over something small. They usually did. Amara had been working on a personal restoration project, a 1920s secretary desk she'd sourced from an estate sale in Ridgewood, her own money, her own interest, something she'd carried up to the east-facing room on the 3rd floor that she'd quietly converted into a workspace. She had her tools there, her reference books, a second-hand daylight lamp. It was the first space in the house that was entirely hers. One of Tae-jun's security team, not Cho, one of the newer ones, a man named Bake, who had all the interpersonal warmth of parking structure, had gone through the room. Not ransacked, not dramatic, just entered, assessed, noted the contents on whatever inventory system the estate ran on, and left. Without asking. Amara found out when she noticed her reference books had been moved. Not by much, but she always put them back in a specific order, and they were not in that order. She went to find Tae-jun. He was in the study, jacket off, mid-call. He held up one finger without looking at her. She waited. He finished the call. "Someone went through my workspace," she said. He looked at her. "The security team does a weekly sweep of all rooms in the estate. All rooms. It's standard protocol. It's my room. It's a room in my estate." The sentence landed between them, and neither of them moved. Amara looked at him for a long moment. "Say that again." Tae-jun's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a recognition, maybe, of how those words had sounded when they hit the air. I know what you meant." Her voice was even. Not raised, possibly more dangerous for it, "and I understand you have security protocols, and I'm not asking you to abandon them. I'm asking you to tell me when they're going to apply to my personal space. I'm asking for the basic courtesy of being informed, and not consulted, informed." "Amara, I left my life," she said, and her voice didn't break, but it thickened at the edges, just slightly. "I left my work and my neighborhood, and the space I had that was mine, and I did that because I made an agreement, and I keep my agreements. But I am not furniture in this house. I am not a room that gets swept." Silence. Tae-jun sat with that. When he spoke, his voice was careful, not defensive. Careful in the way of someone who understood they'd stepped on something real. "I'll have Cho speak to the team. Your room will be notified before entry." "Thank you." She turned to go. "Amara." She stopped. "I don't think of you as furniture." She looked back at him. "I know, a beat. That's why I told you, instead of just being angry about it." She left. She went back to her workspace and sat with the secretary desk, and ran her hands along the warped front panel and breathed through the residual shake in her chest. It wasn't about the room. It was about the fact that she had no idea, still, what she was inside this arrangement. Not a wife in any real sense. Not a guest. She lived here. She cooked here. She'd put her books on the shelves, and her mother's earrings on the bathroom counter. Not a threat. Not a partner. She was something for which she didn't have a word yet. And not having the word made everything harder to carry. The thing she didn't expect was how much Tae-jun's loneliness looked like discipline. She'd assumed before she knew him, in the way you assume things about powerful men who've done terrible things, that he was armored by choice. That the distance was protection. That somewhere underneath the controlled surface, there was a man who knew what he wanted and had simply decided to want it alone. What she found instead was a man who had been told for so long that he was dangerous to get close that he'd stopped getting close to anything. Not dramatically, not with bitterness. He'd just contracted, down to the size of what was necessary. Work, organization, decisions. It showed up in small ways that she noticed because she was the kind of person who noticed small things. He had no photographs. Not one. Not in the study. Not in his bedroom. She'd seen it once, briefly, when Mrs. Park had needed her to relay a message, and the door was open. Clean. Ordered. A bed that looked like it had never been slept in with abandon. He didn't know what kind of music he liked because he didn't listen to music. When Amara put on a record, an old Coltrane album she'd brought from her parents' collection, he'd stood in the kitchen doorway the first time and just listened without moving for almost 3 minutes before he realized she'd noticed him. He'd walked away without commenting. The next evening, she put the record on again. He stayed in the kitchen and helped with the onions. He had exactly 2 people he called by their first names. Cho, and gradually increasingly Amara. She started to understand that she was not simply living in his house. She was, somehow, the most personal thing in it. The attack came on a Thursday. Tae-jun was in Philadelphia 2 days, a meeting she didn't ask about, and he didn't detail the usual arrangement. Mrs. Park was running the household. The security rotation was normal. 4 men on the perimeter, 2 inside, cameras on every approach. Amara was in her workspace at 9 in the evening, finishing the lower left drawer of the secretary desk, when the feed on the small security monitor she'd almost unplugged. Before Cho insisted she leave it, switched to something that made her set down her sanding block and stand up. 2 figures at the east approach, then a third at the north, moving in a way that people didn't move unless they had a reason. Her chest went cold, and then immediately, almost before the cold finished, her brain went somewhere very practical. She hit the silent alarm switch had shown her on her second week in the estate. Not the loud one. The one that went directly to the security team's phones. Then she picked up the house phone and called Mrs. Park's extension. "I need you to get everyone into the reinforced room off the east corridor," she said. "Right now. Calmly, please, but right now." Mrs. Park's voice on the other end, Miss Amara. "I've already hit the alert. His team is coming. This is a precaution. Please go." She hung up. She watched the monitor. The 3 figures had stopped at the east garden wall. One of them was looking at the house. Amara was aware that her heart was going very fast. She was also aware, simultaneously, that panic was a luxury for after. She went through the 3rd floor to the west-facing storage room that Cho had shown her, a room she'd been through twice, both times, because he'd insisted. There was a reinforced door, a bolt lock, enough supply for 48 hours. She got everyone in. Mrs. Park, Jin-ho, 2 other staff members who'd been on overnight. She counted them. She bolted the door. Then she sat on the floor with her back against the door, because that is where she put herself, and she looked at the 4 people in that room with her who were all looking at her, and she said, "We're going to be fine. It'll be about 12 minutes for the response team." Jin-ho said, "How do you know 12 minutes? Cho told me." She looked at her watch. 11 minutes and 40 seconds now. She counted in her head. She didn't let any of the 4 people in that room see her hands shaking. The response team arrived in 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Tae-jun arrived from Philadelphia at 2 in the morning. Amara was in the kitchen. Not cooking, she'd made tea and then not touched it. She was sitting at the island with her hands around the mug, and she was fine, genuinely fine. The shaking had stopped, and she was nevertheless not capable of being in any room that wasn't the kitchen right now. She heard the front door. She heard Cho's voice, clipped, reporting. She heard Tae-jun's footsteps. She knew them by now. That particular pace, and then they changed. Coming faster. He came through the kitchen doorway and stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. He crossed the room in about 4 steps and stood directly in front of her, and he put both hands on either side of her face, just for a second, not grabbing, just covering, like checking for damage, and then he stepped back, and she could see the effort it cost him to step back. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. A fact he was confirming. "I'm all right. Everyone's fine. I got them into the storage room." She looked at her hands. It was 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Cho said 12. He was pretty close. Tae-jun looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. It wasn't the controlled surface. It wasn't the careful, measured man who said precisely what he meant to say. It was something underneath, all of that, coming up through the cracks. He pulled out the stool beside her and sat down, not across the island. Beside her. They were testing the perimeter, he said. Reconnaissance. Likely Park Sungdal's people. He said the name like it was already a problem with a solution in progress. "It won't happen again." "I know. I should have," he stopped. "Should have what?" She looked at him. "Been here? You can't be here every minute." "I should have prepared you better." "You prepared me fine." Cho prepared me fine. She finally picked up the tea. Cold. She drank it anyway. I knew where the alarm was. I knew about the room. I knew the timeline. She set the mug down. The one thing I didn't know was if I'd be able to stay calm enough to do it. Were you? She considered that honestly. I don't know. I think I was calm enough. Whether it was real calm or performed calm, I'm still not sure. He was quiet. I kept counting, she said, in my head. To give myself something to hold on to. She looked at her watch. It was a very long 11 minutes. Tae-jun looked at his hands on the counter. Amara. She looked at him. He looked up. He paused. Started again. I have trusted very few people in my life. Most of them were a professional necessity. A beat. You are not a professional necessity. She waited. What you did tonight, he stopped again. It was basic, she said quietly. No, he shook his head. It was not basic. He looked at her directly. I've had trained men lose their heads in less. You moved 4 people into safety in a building you've lived in for 3 months, without panic, and you sat with them in a locked room and counted minutes out loud so nobody, say, would spiral. She looked at the counter. I trust you, Tae-jun said. It came out like something he'd been carrying for a while and had decided to set down, more than I have trusted anyone. And I don't know what to do with that. Amara was quiet for a moment. The kitchen hummed around them. Outside, somewhere the river was doing what the river always did, indifferent and constant. You don't have to do anything with it, she said finally. That's not how trust works. She looked at him. You just have it. He held her gaze. Something passed between them, not dramatic, not declared. Just real. The kind of thing that happens between people when they've stopped pretending and neither of them can quite find the exit anymore. Tae-jun looked away first. He stood. You should sleep. You should, too. She looked at him. When did you last actually sleep? Philadelphia. Was that real sleep or the meeting is at 6:00? I'll close my eyes for 3 hours sleep. He paused, the second one. Go to bed, Tae-jun. He almost smiled. It still wasn't quite a smile, but it was almost one. Good night, Amara. Good night. He left. She sat in the kitchen alone and put her hands flat on the cool counter and breathed slowly in and out and let the evening finally finish itself inside her chest. She was in love with him. She hadn't decided to be. It wasn't a decision. It was a fact she found when she stopped looking somewhere else, the way you find a thing you've been stepping around. She didn't know what to do with it either. She got up, rinsed her mug, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. 3 weeks later, the nausea started. She assumed it was stress. Then she assumed it was the change in her eating. She'd been cooking more heavily, richer food. Winter was settling in. Then she assumed it was the disrupted sleep schedule she'd had since the security breach, because every time she heard something outside in the night she was awake, and her heart was already moving before she fully was. The dizziness started on a Tuesday. The exhaustion had been building for 2 weeks by then, but she'd explaining that away too. It was the craving that finally made her stop explaining. She had never in her adult life wanted pineapple for breakfast. She did not particularly like pineapple. She had walked past the fruit bowl one morning and seen the pineapple misses. Park had bought for a salad and felt such a specific, overwhelming pull toward it that she'd stood in front of the bowl for a full 30 seconds, processing the experience. She ate half the pineapple. She went to the pharmacy by herself that afternoon, while Tae-jun was at a meeting. She bought what she needed. She went back to her workspace and sat on the floor with her back against the desk she'd finally finished restoring, and she waited the required amount of time, and she looked at the result. She sat with it for a long time. It was not possible. She knew it was not possible. The doctors had been clear. Tae-jun had been told whatever the specific medical language was, however the diagnosis had been framed, that this was not a road that was open to him. They had never discussed it because there was nothing to discuss. It was a closed door. She looked at the test again. She bought 3 more from a different pharmacy. All 4 said the same thing. She sat in the middle of her workspace floor, with 4 pregnancy tests lined up beside the restored secretary desk that she'd spent 8 weeks bringing back from nothing, and she pressed one hand flat against her stomach, and she cried in a way she hadn't cried since she'd packed her parents' house. Not from fear, not entirely from joy, from the enormous, staggering weight of something she hadn't let herself want. She cried until she was empty. Then she stood up, washed her face in the small bathroom at the end of the hall, and went to find Tae-jun. She found him coming out of the study. He took one look at her face and stopped moving. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She looked at him across the hallway. She said, "We need to talk." Something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not recognition, not any specific thing she could name. Just a man going very still, because the quality of those 4 words told him that what came next was going to change the shape of something. "Come in," he said, and stood back from the study doorway. Amara walked past him into the room. She set the test on his desk. Tae-jun looked at it. He stood completely still for long enough that she started counting And in her head, the way she'd counted in the locked room during the security breach, just to give herself something to hold. She got to 19. When he looked up, his face was doing something she had never seen it do, had not thought it was capable of doing every layer of the controlled surface, every year of learned stillness, everything he'd built to keep the world at the correct distance, cracking open. Not breaking, cracking, like light coming through a fault line. This isn't, he stopped. I know what it isn't supposed to be, Amara said. He looked at the test again, then at her. You're certain? I took 4. She sat down in the chair across from his desk because her legs had decided they'd done enough. 4 different brands. I've been sick for 3 weeks. I've been exhausted, and I ate half a pineapple at 7 in the morning. Something she had never expected crossed Tae-jun's face. He sat down, not in his chair, on the edge of the desk. Like his body just landed there, like whatever was holding him upright had momentarily redirected. He put one hand over his mouth. She watched him sit with it. This man who had run a criminal organization for 15 years, who had negotiated with men who wanted him dead, who had stood in rooms where the wrong word meant the end of everything, and had never once, in all the time she'd known him, looked like he didn't know where to put himself. He looked like he didn't know where to put himself. Tae-jun, she said. He looked at her. His eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, just the very edge of it. The place before. We should see a doctor, she said. A real one. Not here. Not someone you know. Someone independent. He nodded. One nod. Very deliberate. Okay, he said. His voice was different. Lower. Okay, she looked at him. Are you all right? She asked. He looked at the test on his desk. I was told. Stopped. Breathed. I was told that this door was closed. He said it quietly. I accepted that. I built everything around accepting that. I know. He looked at her. And now you're sitting in this room and there is a... He stopped again, like the word was too large for his mouth. There is, Amara confirmed. He was quiet. Then are you afraid? She thought about it honestly. Yes, but not of it. She looked at her hands. I'm afraid of everything around it, of what it means. She stopped, started again. I don't know what this makes us. He looked at her steadily. It makes us responsible, he said. That's one word for it. It's the right one. He stood up from the desk. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair, a thing she had never seen him do, physically put himself lower than another person, and he looked at her directly. Whatever else this is, he said, this child is not a complication. This child is not a problem to be managed. His voice was steady. Completely. Do you understand me? She looked at him. His eyes were still at the very edge. She put one hand against the side of his face, just for a second. The way you touch something you can't believe is real. I understand you, she said. He closed his eyes. The study was very quiet. Outside, the Hudson moved past in the dark, carrying everything it always carried, adding this to it, and moving on. And somewhere in the estate that Amara had slowly, stubbornly, accidentally turned into a home, something that had been approaching for months, finally arrived, not announced, not dramatic, just present, the way permanent things arrive. 3 days later, a doctor they'd never met confirmed what all 4 tests had already said. And 2 days after that, someone made a phone call that should never have been made. And by the following morning, the East Coast underworld knew that Kang Tae-jun's wife was carrying his child. The leak hit the underworld, the way a stone hits still water one point of impact, then rings spreading outward in every direction until the entire surface was moving. Tae-jun found out on a Monday morning from Cho, who came into the study at 6:52 and closed the door behind him and stood there with the particular stillness he used when the information he was carrying was going to require a response that couldn't be rushed. Tae-jun was on his second coffee. He set it down. How wide, he said. East Coast organization heads, as of last night. Cho's voice was flat. Informational, Park Sung-dal's people. The Tremblay Network in Boston. Kim Jae-won's contact in Newark. A pause. It was specific. Blood type confirmed. Gestational age. Tae-jun was very still. Medical information, he said. Yes. Which means someone had access to medical information. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment. The clinic, Tae-jun said. We're looking at staff. There were 4 people in the room when the confirmation was given. The physician, 2 nurses, 1 administrative intake person. Cho had a folder. He set it on the desk. Background runs are underway. But Tae-jun, he rarely used the name directly. The fact that he did now meant something. The level of detail in what circulated. It wasn't overheard. It was documented. Tae-jun opened the folder. Read the first page. Closed it. Who has already moved on it? Park is increasing his surveillance on your transit routes. Tremblay has pulled 2 men from his Boston operation, and they were photographed in Fort Lee yesterday morning. Cho paused. Kim Jae-won sent a congratulatory message through back channels. Kim is being sarcastic. Kim is being Kim. Tae-jun stood up. He walked to the window. The Hudson was gray that morning, the kind of gray that looked cold all the way down. They were waiting, he said. They were waiting, Cho confirmed. Waiting for what? He didn't have to finish. They had been waiting for the succession question to answer itself. Either Tae-jun died without an heir and the organization fractured along its existing fault lines, or he secured succession and they had to recalibrate entirely. The pregnancy changed everything. An heir meant a dynasty. A dynasty meant the Kang organization didn't dissolve when Tae-jun did it continued. It deepened. It became generational. That was more threatening than anything he had built himself. Double the perimeter, Tae-jun said. I want 2 additional men on Amara at all times. Not visible, I don't want her feeling caged, but present. Cho nodded. And find me the source of the leak. We will. Today, Cho left. Tae-jun stood at the window and looked at the gray river and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear. He'd processed fear out of his system years ago, replaced it with calculation. Not anger either, though anger was there, underneath, banked and controlled. What he felt was the specific cold of a man who realizes the walls he built to protect something have, in being built, drawn a target on it. He'd spent 15 years making himself dangerous enough that coming for him was prohibitively expensive. He'd been successful enough at it that most organizations left him alone, not because they liked him, but because removing him cost more than tolerating him. He had not, in all of that, thought clearly enough about what it meant to have something worth taking. He had Amara now. He had a child coming, and the entire East Coast underworld had just been told about it. He didn't tell Amara immediately. He told himself it was because she was 8 weeks along and the doctor had used the words elevated baseline stress and blood pressure monitoring, and he was not going to be the person who handed her the thing that elevated it further. He told himself it was strategic. He needed more information before there was anything concrete to tell her. Both of those things were true. The third thing, which he didn't examine too closely, was that he didn't want to see the specific look she would give him when she understood that the life he'd brought her into had just reached for the thing she was carrying. He lasted 4 days. Amara figured it out on the 3rd day and waited 1 more to give him the chance to tell her himself. She was in the kitchen when she said it, not looking at him. She was making tea, her back half turned, her voice completely level. The security rotation changed, she said. Tae-jun looked up from his phone. There are 2 men outside the East Garden now, instead of 1. Cho has been doing walkthroughs of the house interior twice a day instead of once. And yesterday when I asked Jin-ho to go pick up a book I'd ordered from the store in Englewood, he said he'd have to check the schedule. She poured hot water. Jin-ho has never had to check a schedule to go to Englewood. Silence. She turned around. Her face was composed. Her eyes were not angry. They were the eyes of a woman who had already done the math and was waiting for someone to confirm the answer. Tell me, she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting. She stood at the kitchen counter with her tea, and she listened to everything, the leak, the medical detail, the organizations that had responded, the perimeter adjustments, the ongoing investigation into the clinic staff. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 4 days, she said. Amara, you knew for 4 days. I was trying to get more information before. Before what? Her voice was still even. Before I had to know that my medical records were shared with criminals? Before I had to know that people who want you dead now know I'm pregnant? She set her mug down. What information were you going to get? that would make that easier to hear. He didn't have an answer. I know you were protecting me. She looked at him directly. I know that is what you believe you were doing. But I am carrying your child inside my body, and people with resources and motivation now know that. And you made a decision to let me walk around for 4 days, not knowing. She shook her head. That is not protection. That is management. And I told you months ago I am not a room to be managed. You're right, he said. Immediately. No qualification. She looked at him. You're right, he said again. I won't do it again. She picked up her tea. What are we doing about the leak? He blinked slightly. The Wee Cho is running background on the clinic staff. It's not the clinic staff. He looked at her. Think about it. She leaned against the counter. The clinic was new. We chose it specifically because it had no connection to your organization. Even if someone there sold the information, how did they know it was worth selling? How did they know who you were? Who would they sell it to, and how would they know who to call? She shook her head. The information came from inside. Someone who already knew you. Someone who knew to look. The kitchen was quiet. Tae-jun looked at her. You've been thinking about this for 4 days, he said. I've been thinking about it for 3. A pause. One day to be furious that you hadn't told me yet. He held her gaze. Something in the room had shifted. Not the argument was done, resolved in the way their arguments resolved, without pride getting in the way. Something else, the quality of what she just said and what it implied. Who has access to your medical history within the organization? She asked. Almost no one. Cho, my attorney, Song-ho, because he managed the original diagnosis consultation. He said the name the way you say, the name of something you've always assumed was bedrock. Amara didn't say anything. She just looked at him. She didn't push it further that morning. She could see that he needed to sit with it, and she understood the particular difficulty of a suspicion aimed at family the way it doesn't arrive cleanly, the way it keeps getting tested against memory, against affection, against 20 years of a person being one thing before they become something else entirely. She let it sit. She went back to the guest room she'd converted into a workspace, and she did something she'd been doing for 6 weeks without knowing she was building a case. When Tae-jun first asked her to settle into the estate, she'd needed something to occupy her hands and her brain during the long hours he was unavailable. She'd found in the estate's East Library a room that Tae-jun used primarily for storage of things that needed to be somewhere decades of accumulated Kang family correspondence. Business documents, letters, contracts, ledgers going back to the early years of the organization when Tae-jun's father ran it. She'd started organizing them the way she organized anything, by era, by type, by relevance. It was something she could do quietly, without anyone needing her to do it, and it gave her hands something useful while her mind worked through everything else. She had not been looking for anything. That was the thing about finding something you weren't looking for. It arrived with a particular authority that deliberate searching couldn't manufacture. You couldn't dismiss it as paranoia or projection. It was just there. The first inconsistency had been a payment record. A quarterly disbursement routed through a shell company she didn't recognize to an account labeled medical consultation specialist. The disbursement predated Tae-jun's original infertility diagnosis by 4 months and continued for 3 years after it. She had looked at that record for a long time. Medical consultation. Specialist, but not in Tae-jun's personal records. Not routed through his accounts. Routed through a subsidiary that, when she traced the naming convention against other records in the same era, connected consistently to Song-ho's administrative domain. Paying a medical specialist from Seong-ho's accounts 4 months before Tae-jun received a devastating diagnosis from that same specialist's institutional network. She'd flagged it in her mind and kept organizing. More came. Private correspondence between Song-ho and a man named Dr. Lim, not the primary physician, but a consulting specialist. 2 letters. Careful language. The kind of careful language that people used when they knew the language would matter later. The assessment has been delivered as discussed. The framing emphasizes permanence. The subject is unlikely to seek second opinion given the emotional weight of the conclusion. The subject. Tae-jun. She'd sat with that letter for a long time. Then she'd photographed it, and the payment records. And 3 other documents that, alone, meant very little, but together described a shape, a deliberate, long-constructed architecture of manipulation. Song-ho, systematically ensuring that Tae-jun would never believe he could have children. Never seek a second opinion. Never question the diagnosis that was slowly dissolving his own succession and positioning Seong-ho to step into what came after. She had not told Tae-jun yet. She needed to be certain. She had spent 3 more weeks being certain. She was certain. She told him on a Wednesday evening. Not at the kitchen table. In the library, because the documents were there, and she wanted him to see them in the room where they lived, not carried somewhere else. Context mattered with things like this. She spread them across the library table in order. Payment records first, the correspondence second, 3 supporting documents third. She'd cross-referenced the shell company and found 2 more payments she hadn't initially flagged. Tae-jun stood at the table and read. He read slowly. He was not a slow reader, she knew, that from watching him work through briefings the speed of his eyes across a page. He was reading slowly because he was reading each document twice. Because he was checking his own comprehension against what he already knew. Because he was doing the thing you do when your brain is trying to protect you from a conclusion it hasn't finished refusing yet. She stood at the other side of the table and waited. He got to the letter. He stopped. She watched him read it. She watched him read it again. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, and she watched his hands and not his face because she thought his face was something he might not want, observed right now, and she thought she owed him that. His hands didn't move. The room was very quiet. When he finally looked up, his face was controlled. The surface was there, but underneath it something was moving that she'd never seen before, a deep tectonic thing, too large to name quickly. "How long have you had these?" he said. "I found the first one 6 weeks ago. I've been verifying since then." He looked back at the letter. "The framing emphasizes permanence," he said, reading it aloud. Very quiet. "Yes, he paid someone to tell me I couldn't have children." She didn't answer because the question wasn't a question. Tae-jun stepped back from the table. 1 step. He put 1 hand over his mouth and stood there, with his weight shifted, and she watched him hold all of it in the way he held difficult things, by going very still and very internal and processing it somewhere she couldn't see. 15 years, he said. She waited. 15 years, I thought. He stopped. "I made decisions because of this. I arranged my life around it." He stopped again. The carefully constructed sentence wasn't working. The words weren't fitting what was underneath. "He raised me," Tae-jun said, and that sentence was different, rougher, unstructured, the kind of sentence that comes out of someone's chest rather than their head. "After my father died, he was there." He was stopped. Amara came around the table. She stood beside him. Not touching, just present in the immediate space, close enough that he wasn't alone in whatever room he was in right now. "I know," she said. "He was the one who took me to the doctor." He said it quietly, almost to himself. He organized the consultation. He was there when they gave me the result. A pause. "He put his hand on my shoulder when I heard it." Amara was quiet. And the whole time she confirmed. He put both hands on the table and looked at the documents, and she could see the exact moment when grief, the specific grief of a person betrayed by something they loved, tipped into something harder. Not colder, just resolved. A man deciding what the information meant and what it required. He straightened up. "He leaked the pregnancy," Tae-jun said. "I think so. Because it destroyed his plan. If you have an heir, the succession question closes. Everything he spent 15 years positioning for disappears." She looked at him. "I don't think he expected me. I think he expected you to marry someone manageable. Someone who would stay in the rooms she was given." Tae-jun looked at her. "Instead, you got someone who reorganizes the rooms," she said. Something broke through his face. Not a smile, but adjacent to one, briefly, before it closed again. "I need to confront him," Tae-jun said. "I know. Not alone." She looked at him. "He dismissed you," Tae-jun said. "He looked at you at our wedding and saw an antique shop owner from Inglewood who would be a visible wife and nothing else. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. He needs to know exactly who found this. Amara looked at the documents on the table, at the letter with its careful, devastating language, at the payment records, at everything Sung-ho had built over 15 years to hollow out his nephew's future. When, she said. Soon. He began gathering the documents carefully. I need to call the family council. I need to do this inside the structure, not outside it. If I go to him privately, he'll deny it, and we spend weeks in back channels. If I bring it to the council with everything you've found, he can't deny it in front of everyone. No. He looked at her. Are you prepared for that room? She thought about the locked safe room. 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The four people looking at her like she was the ceiling between them and the sky. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He picked up the last document. He paused. Amara. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was looking at the document in his hand, whatever you came into this, as whatever the arrangement was supposed to be. He stopped. Started again. You have protected this family more completely than anyone who ever called themselves part of it. She didn't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he said, as if he'd heard her not saying it. I just needed to say it. He set the document on the stack. He left the library to make the calls. Amara stood at the table alone, in the room full of evidence of a 15-year betrayal, one hand resting on her stomach, and she breathed. The council meeting was called for Friday. Thursday night was when everything changed. Amara had been experiencing headaches for 2 weeks. The OB they'd found quietly, carefully, chosen by Cho, using a procedure that involved 3 years of anonymization, had noted elevated blood pressure at the last appointment and asked her to track it daily and rest more. She'd been tracking it. She hadn't been resting more. Because the council meeting was in less than 48 hours, and there were documents to organize, and she was not someone who rested when there was work to be done. She knew this about herself. It was not always a virtue. Thursday afternoon, she was in the library cross-referencing one final financial document when the headache went from something she was managing to something she was not. It arrived like a door, slamming sudden on one side, bad enough that she put the paper down and put both hands flat on the table and waited to see if it would pass. It did not pass. It became something else. Pressure behind her eyes. A specific dizziness that was different from the pregnancy dizziness she'd grown accustomed to. That dizziness was manageable, floaty. This one was directional and sharp. She sat down on the floor. Not dramatically. Just the chair was farther than the floor, and she needed to be lower immediately. She sat with her back against the library shelves, and her knees up and breathed through it. Mrs. Park found her 7 minutes later, coming in to let her know dinner was ready. She didn't remember much after that. She remembered Mrs. Park's voice very calm, very fast, which was exactly the right combination of things. She remembered the floor feeling very steady under her, which she was grateful for. She remembered hearing Tae-jun's voice before she expected to. And then she was at Hudson Meridian Medical Center. The diagnosis was not a surprise to the doctor. It was a well-understood complication of high-risk pregnancies in women with elevated baseline blood pressure. It had a name that sounded clinical and clean and did not communicate adequately the speed at which it could become catastrophic. The doctor used the phrase, "we're going to need to monitor very closely," and the phrase "complete bed rest," and the phrase "the next 48 hours" are important. Tae-jun heard all of it. He stood beside Amara's hospital bed, with his hands in his pockets and his face completely still in the way she'd learned, meant he was managing something he couldn't afford to let loose in a medical facility. She was hooked to monitors. The sound of the baby's heartbeat, she'd heard it before, at the OB's office, but in this room with this context it sounded different. More immediate, more insistent. A small, rapid, specific argument for everything being okay. She focused on that. The council meeting, she said. Forget the council meeting. Tae-jun Amara. His voice was quiet. Non-negotiable in a way that wasn't aggressive. Just complete. The meeting will happen when you are not in a hospital bed. She looked at the ceiling. He's going to keep moving. If he figures out we have the documents, then he figures it out. He moved to the chair beside her bed and sat down. He was still in his suit. He'd been at a meeting when Mrs. Park called him. The gray tie. Is nothing in that council room that matters more than what's in this one. She looked at him. His face was doing the thing again, the cracked open thing she'd seen in the study when she'd first told him. Underneath the control, something enormous and close to the surface. I'm okay, she said. I know you are. The baby is okay. They said the heartbeat is... I know. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the hospital blanket. His hand was larger and warmer and very steady. I know. She looked at their hands. I'm going to be difficult about the bed rest, she said. I know that too. I'm just telling you in advance. I know. He looked at her. I'm going to be worse about enforcing it. She almost laughed. The monitor kept its steady count beside them. Outside Ngustown, the hospital room, the East Coast underworld was recalibrating around the news of an heir. Song Sunso was somewhere making calculations. The council meeting was delayed, and every hour of delay was an hour that a man who had spent 15 years outmaneuvering everyone around him had to prepare. Amara knew all of this. She also knew that the documents were photographed and stored in 3 separate locations. She knew exactly what each one said. She knew the shape of the argument and the order in which to present it and the specific moment when Song-ho's careful composure would crack in front of the people whose respect he'd spent decades cultivating. She was in a hospital bed with her blood pressure being monitored and her husband's hand over hers and a baby's heartbeat keeping beside her. She was not finished. She was not anywhere close to finished. She closed her eyes and let the monitor count, and she thought about what Seong-ho had done, not just to Tae-jun's future, but to her child's, and to the years Tae-jun had spent believing the worst about himself, because a man he trusted had arranged for him to believe it. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not anger exactly. It was colder than anger. It was the feeling of a woman who restored broken things for a living, who understood better than most people the difference between something genuinely beyond repair and something that merely needed someone patient enough and precise enough to find the fault line and work from there. She had found the fault line. She was going to work from there. And Seong-ho, who had looked at her at a wedding and seen an outsider playing a temporary role, had made the oldest mistake available to powerful men who had gone unchallenged for too long. He had looked at her and decided she didn't matter. She kept her eyes closed. She listened to her baby's heartbeat. She waited for her blood pressure to come down, because she was going to need it lower than this, for what came next, and she was done being careless with the things that were worth protecting. Amara spent 6 days in Hudson Meridian before the doctor released her, with a list of conditions that she read twice and memorized completely, because if she was going to break some of them, she wanted to know exactly which one she was breaking and why. Complete bed rest was non-negotiable. The doctor used that phrase twice, underlining it the second time with the particular emphasis of someone who suspected they were being managed. Stress reduction, daily blood pressure monitoring, no sustained physical exertion, follow-up in 5 days. She agreed to all of it in the room. In the car going home, she told Tae-jun they needed to schedule the council meeting for the following week. He looked at her. I'm not going to be in the room, she said, before he could answer. I'm not arguing about that, but the documents need to go in, and they need to go in before Seong-ho figures out what we have. Every day we wait is a day he has to build a counter-narrative. She looked at her hands in her lap. I can prepare everything from the house. I can organize the presentation. You and Cho take it in. Tae-jun was quiet for a moment. 5 days, he said. 5 days, you rest for 5 days. Actually rest. Define rest. Horizontal. I can be horizontal and still. Amara. She stopped. He wasn't looking at her, he was watching the road, the city moving past them in the early evening light, but his voice had the quality it got when he was not negotiating. Not the hard edge of command. Something more direct than that. Something that came from a place closer to the surface than he usually operated from. 5 days, he said. Then we do this. She looked at him for a moment. 5 days, she said. She rested for 4.5. The half day was borderline, she decided, because she was sitting up in bed with the documents arranged across the blanket and a legal pad against her knees, and that was barely exertion by any reasonable definition. Tae-jun found her at 11 in the morning on the 5th day with the legal pad covered in her handwriting and 6 documents color-coded with small paper tabs she'd made from a notepad. He stood in the bedroom doorway. She looked up. "I was going to wait until after lunch," she said. He came into the room, picked up the legal pad, read the first page. His expression moved through several things. He set the pad down. "You organized it by impact," he said. "Led with the financial records because they're verifiable independently. The correspondence second because it requires context from the records to land properly. The medical documentation last because by the time they've seen the money trail and the letters, the medical piece closes it. It stops being circumstantial and becomes a pattern." She looked at him. "If you lead with the medical documents, Seong-ho reframes it as a misunderstanding between family members. If you lead with the money, it's fraud before anyone's decided how they feel about him, personally." Tae-jun looked at her. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since the hospital." She shifted slightly against the pillows. "I had 6 days of bed rest. I thought about a lot of things." He sat down on the edge of the bed. He picked up the legal pad again and read further, and she watched him read, and she thought about the past 4.5 days, the long, quiet hours that had been simultaneously the most frightening and clarifying of her life. She had lain in that hospital and listened to the monitor count her baby's heartbeat, and thought about her mother who had died within 2 weeks of her father because the grief had nowhere to go. She had thought about the shop Denise, running it, still calling, every few days, voice carefully light, in the way of people who have learned not to ask for things. She had thought about the secretary desk she'd finished restoring, sitting in her workspace now, complete. Thought about the fact that she had spent her entire adult life restoring things that other people had broken and left behind, and here she was, inside the largest broken thing she'd ever encountered, a family constructed on a lie, a man who'd built his entire understanding of himself around a diagnosis someone else had engineered, and she was 3 documents and 1 council meeting away from fixing it. She was not going to let her blood pressure stop her. She was going to manage her blood pressure and do the thing anyway. "The sequence is right," Tae-jun said, setting the pad down. "I know." He looked at her. "The council meets Thursday." "That's 3 days." "Yes." She nodded. "I need you to get me Cho for an hour tomorrow. I want to walk him through the presentation sequence so he can read the room while you're speaking. Cho reads people better than anyone. If Seong-ho is building towards something, Cho will see it before it lands. I'll have him here in the morning. And I need one more thing." Tae-jun waited. "I want to be in the building," she said. "I won't be in the room. I'll stay in a private office, away from the council room, blood pressure monitor and all. But I want to be there." He started to say something. "If something goes sideways," she said, "you might need me to talk you through the documentation sequence in real time. Cho is good, but he doesn't know these records the way I do. And Seong-ho has been in that organization for 30 years. He knows how to talk his way through a hard room." She held his gaze. "I need to be close enough to matter." The room was quiet. Outside, the Hudson was doing its usual thing, moving, constant, indifferent to everything happening on its banks. "You wear the monitor the entire time," he said. "Yes." "If it goes above the threshold the doctor specified, I'll leave immediately. Cho will have someone with you at all times." "Understood." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when a decision was made and the time for negotiating was done. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed. The Kang organization's Manhattan headquarters occupied 4 floors of a building in Midtown that presented itself to the world as a property management and logistics firm, which was accurate enough that nobody felt they were lying when they said it out loud. The council room was on the 3rd floor, a long rectangular space with a black table that could seat 16, windows on the east side that looked across toward Queens, and walls that had absorbed over the decades a quantity of difficult decisions that had shaped the East Coast underworld in ways most people would never know. Amara had never been in the council room. She was in a private office on the same floor, 2 doors down, when the council assembled on Thursday morning. The office had a window, a chair, A small table where Cho had placed a blood pressure monitor, a glass of water, and a communication earpiece that connected her to a second device in Cho's jacket pocket. Not a full audio feed of the room that wasn't possible, but a direct line to Cho, so that if she needed to relay something, she could. She sat in the chair and put the cuff on her arm and took her baseline reading. Within acceptable range, she exhaled. Through the wall, she could hear almost nothing. The building was well constructed. She could hear her own breathing, the faint hum of the ventilation system, and the distant sound of the city below. She waited. Song-ho arrived last. Tae-jun noted it. He noted everything in rooms like this: who came early, who came on time, who came last, and what the lateness communicated. Seong-ho had always been a precise timekeeper. 15 minutes early to everything, every meeting of his entire career, because early arrival was a form of control. It let you see people come in, watch them settle, read their posture before they'd arranged it for an audience. Arriving last meant something. Song-ho came through the door at 9:03 and took his chair at the table with the careful grace of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to occupy space without seeming to claim it. 60 years of practice. Gray hair, a dark suit. A face that had learned to express warmth so consistently that the warmth itself had become the mask. He looked at Tae-jun. He looked at the table. He did not look at the chair beside Tae-jun that was conspicuously empty. "We're missing someone," said Lee Byung-soo, who ran the organization's Newark corridor and had the interpersonal subtlety of a construction crane. "My wife is resting on medical advice," Tae-jun said. "She sends her regards." Song-ho smiled, of course. "Her health comes first. We're also glad the hospital stay resolved cleanly." He said it warmly. Tae-jun looked at him, said nothing. He let the silence sit for exactly 4 seconds, which was long enough to be noticed and short enough that Seong-ho couldn't respond to it without seeming reactive. Then he opened the folder. "I called this council because there are matters requiring your collective attention," Tae-jun said. "The first is the breach of my wife's medical confidentiality, which resulted in details of her pregnancy being distributed across multiple East Coast networks." He looked around the table. "The second is the source of that breach." Seong-ho's expression did not change. That, Tae-jun noted, was the tell. Most people's expressions changed when they heard themselves approached. Seong-ho's didn't, because Seong-ho had known this was coming, not the specifics, not the documents, but the direction of travel. He'd had time to prepare the face. That meant he'd known Tae-jun suspected him, which meant someone in Tae-jun's circle had told him. Tae-jun set the first document on the table and slid it to the center. Quarterly disbursements, routed through a shell company, traced back to a subsidiary operating under the administrative domain of this council's senior elder. He looked at Song-ho. "Predating my original diagnosis by 4 months. The room absorbed that." Lee Byung-soo picked up the document and read it. Seong-ho said calmly, "Those records require context." "The context is coming." Tae-jun set the second document on the table. In the office 2 doors down, Amara pressed the earpiece and said quietly, "He's going to say the payments were for legitimate consultation. He'll have a cover story prepared. Probably something about a second opinion protocol he initiated on your father's behalf before the organization transitioned to you. He'll frame it as loyalty." A pause. Cho's voice in her ear very low. He already said consultation. "Tae-jun is moving to the letters." She closed her eyes. "Good," she thought. The letters close it. Her blood pressure monitor read 12 points lower than her morning baseline. She was running cold and focused, which was how she'd run through the antique shop during the worst months, when there was more work than money and she'd had to decide which repairs to take and which to turn away, and there was no good answer, only the least bad one. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby was quiet. She listened to the thin sound of Cho's breathing in her ear and waited. The letter landed on the table and the room changed. Not dramatically. Rooms full of men like these didn't change dramatically. They were all, to varying degrees, trained to keep their faces neutral under pressure. But something shifted in the quality of the silence. The letter was read, passed, read again. "The assessment has been delivered as discussed. The framing emphasizes permanence. The subject is unlikely to seek second opinion given the emotional weight of the conclusion. Lee Byung-soo set the letter down and looked at Song-ho. Park Hoon, who ran the organization's financial networks and had said almost nothing, since sitting down, took off his glasses and polished a thing Tae-jun had seen him do when he was buying himself 30 seconds to recalibrate. Song-ho looked at the letter, and then, for the first time in 30 years of watching this man across various tables and distas, Tae-jun saw him calculate the room and arrive at a number he didn't like. The wording is ambiguous, Song-ho said. Read it again, Tae-jun said. The subject could refer to any ongoing matter. The payment records date to the week doctor. Lim's consulting fee first appears in his professional billing history, Tae-jun said. He set the third document down. His billing records, obtained through the federal disclosure request we filed in connection with an unrelated matter, corroborate the timeline. He looked at Seong-ho. You paid Dr. Lim to frame the diagnosis. You paid him to make certain I understood the conclusion as permanent. And you paid him quarterly for 3 years, because you needed him to stay quiet for 3 years while I rebuilt my life around what he'd told me. The room was absolutely still. Song-ho sat back. He did it slowly. The way a man sits back when he's given up a position, but hasn't decided yet what position to take next. This is a significant accusation, he said. His voice was steady. 30 years of practice, made by a man whose wife found these documents while unsupervised in the estate's private records. My wife, Tae-jun said, and his voice dropped to something very quiet, is the reason these documents exist in an organized and prosecutable form. Whatever you were going to say about her next, I'd encourage you to stop. Song-ho stopped. The table waited. You orchestrated my diagnosis, Tae-jun continued. You spent 15 years ensuring I believed my bloodline ended with me, so that when the time came, the organization would turn to the only remaining elder with the standing and the history to lead it. He looked at Seong-ho directly. And when my wife became pregnant and destroyed that plan, you leaked her medical records to Park Sung-dal and the Tremblay network, hoping the external pressure would destabilize me before the pregnancy could secure succession. Song-ho said nothing. That was itself an answer. Lee Byung-soo put both hands flat on the table. Song-ho. Still nothing. Say something, Lee said. Because right now this room is looking at documents that say you falsified your nephew's medical diagnosis and sold his wife's private medical information to rival organizations. And if you don't have an answer to that, then this table has to draw its own conclusions. Song-ho looked at Tae-jun. Something happened in his face. Not remorse, Tae-jun had known this man long enough to know that remorse was not in the architecture. Something underneath the calculation, something that might have once been the thing that calculation grew over the way scar tissue grows over an old wound. You were not ready, Song-ho said. Tae-jun was very still. When your father died, you were 22 years old, and you had none of the. Song-ho stopped. Restarted. I built this organization. I built it with your father from the ground up, and I watched you take it, and I watched you make decisions that were. He stopped again. His hands were on the table now, no longer composed. An air would have locked you in. An air would have made the position permanent, and there would have been no correction possible, no adjustment, no. You decided that, Tae-jun said. You decided I needed to be correctable. So you removed the possibility that I could ever secure the future independently. Song-ho looked at him. You raised me, Tae-jun said. The words were very quiet, the quietest thing in the room. You stood beside me when I was 22 years old, and I had just buried my father, and you told me I could do this. You told me. He stopped, and the entire time. The two words sat on the table with everything else. Song-ho said nothing. Tae-jun looked around the table. I will be addressing the financial fraud with federal investigators, he said. The documentation is sufficient for charges, and I have already been in contact with the relevant parties. His voice was completely even. As for this organization, Seong-ho's authority within it is revoked, effective this meeting. His financial network within our structure will be frozen pending audit. His access to any organizational information, personnel, or resources ends today. He looked at Seong-ho. You are done here, he said. In the office 2 doors down, Cho said into the earpiece, It's done. Amara released a breath she'd been managing for 20 minutes. He admitted it. He didn't deny it. A pause, which in that room is the same thing. She looked at the blood pressure cuff on her arm. The reading was elevated. Within range, but elevated. Is he gone? Security is with him now. Another pause. Tae-jun is rapping. She set her palm flat on the small table and looked at the wall and thought, it's done. The thing she'd found in a box of old documents while she was restoring furniture for her mind. The thing she'd built slowly and carefully over 6 weeks, cross-referencing and verifying and making sure before she moved, PC needs to beat, because she'd learned from years of antique work that between a repair that held and one that failed in 6 months was always whether you'd understood the damage completely before you started. She'd understood it completely. It held. The door opened. Tae-jun came in. He filled the doorframe the way he always did, which she'd stopped noticing somewhere around the 3rd month of the marriage, but she noticed it now, the specific presence of a person who has just come through something and is carrying the weight of it in every part of how they stand. She looked at him. He looked at her. He crossed to where she sat and crouched down in front of her chair, his eyes at her level, and he looked at the blood pressure monitor on her arm and then at her face. You're elevated, he said, within range. I'm fine, she held his gaze. It's done? It's done. She exhaled. He looked at her for another moment, and then he put his forehead against hers, not dramatic, not performed. Just the specific gesture of a man who needs to be close to something real and has found it, and she felt the tension in him like a vibration. Everything he'd been holding in that room, for the last 2 hours moving through him, now that he'd let himself stop holding it. He admitted it. Tae-jun said against her temple. I know, Cho told me not everything, but enough. Enough is enough, a pause. He said I wasn't ready, Tae-jun said. She sat with that. When I was 22, he continued. He decided I wasn't ready, and then spent 15 years making sure you stayed in a version of yourself he could manage, he said. He was quiet. You were ready, she said. You were probably more ready than he wanted you to be. That's the thing he was actually afraid of. He lifted his head. He looked at her. She held his gaze. We should go home, she said. Yes. She reached up and took the cup off her arm and handed it to Cho, who appeared in the doorway with the particular silent competence that made him indispensable. She stood. For a moment the room moved slightly, the way it sometimes did in the afternoons. She steadied herself against the table's edge. Tae-jun's hand was at her elbow immediately. Not grabbing, just present. I've got it, she said. I know you do, he said. He didn't move his hand. She didn't tell him to. They walked out of the office and down the corridor toward the elevator. Cho slightly ahead, 2 additional men behind. And Amara kept her pace measured, and her breathing even in her hand was not in Tae-jun's, but their arms were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, which was enough. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. In the mirrored panels, she could see both of them, Tae-jun, gray tie loosened, face carrying everything the last 2 hours had cost. Herself 8 weeks from delivery, blood pressure slightly elevated, wearing the expression of a woman who had just watched something she built do the thing she built it to do. She looked at their reflections. She thought about the secretary desk in her workspace. The one she'd spent 8 weeks on, the grain fighting her, the warp in the lower panel, the months of patience required to get it back to something true. The elevator descended. In the lobby, she could see the street through the glass doors, the city moving past in the ordinary way of cities that have no idea what has just happened inside them. They walked out into the November air, and then 12 steps from the building entrance, beside the car, where Cho was already opening the door, Amara stopped. The pain was different from the headache in the library, different from the dizziness in the hospital. This was lower, tighter, a specific pressure that she'd read about and been told to watch for, and had spent the last 3 weeks telling herself she would recognize. She recognized it. She put one hand on the car door. Tae-jun was beside her in a single step. What? Not a question. We need to go to the hospital, she said, his face. Now, she said. Cho was already on the phone. Tae-jun's hand was at her back, steady. and she felt the specific quality of a man choosing to be steady when every part of him wanted to be something else entirely. And she gripped the car door and breathed through the tightening and thought, "Come on. Not here. Not yet. Wait just a little longer." The car was moving before she'd finished the thought, and beside her Tae-jun's hand hadn't left her back, and the city rushed past the windows, and Cho was talking rapidly into his phone. And Amara closed her eyes and breathed and held on to the one thing that had always worked when everything else was chaos. She counted. 1, 2, 3. And she held on and she let Tae-jun be the ceiling between her and the sky for once. And she did not stop counting until the hospital entrance came into view, and the car had barely stopped before the doors opened. And there were people moving toward them with the specific practiced urgency of people who know that some situations do not wait. The hospital corridor at Hudson Meridian smelled like floor wax and recycled air and the specific antiseptic they used on every surface, every hour, without exception. Tae-jun knew this smell now. He had learned it in increments over the last 2 months, the way the smell of a place you've spent too much time in, not by noticing it, but by stopping noticing it, until one day you realize it has become simply the smell of something that matters. They took Amara through the emergency intake at speed, which was the only way that felt right, and also the only way that felt entirely wrong, because speed in a hospital is both reassurance and its opposite. Tae-jun walked beside the gurney until the doors that he couldn't go through, and then he stood at those doors for a moment, with both hands at his sides. Cho appeared at his shoulder. "They know her history," Cho said. "The OB has been called. She's being assessed now." Tae-jun didn't move. "Tae-jun, I know," he breathed. "I know." He turned and walked to the waiting area and sat in a chair that was designed by someone who had never spent any serious time waiting, and he sat in it anyway, and he looked at his hands. His gray tie was loosened from the council meeting. He took it off. He folded it into his jacket pocket. He looked at the wall across from him, and he thought about Amara's face in the car, the way she had closed her eyes and started counting. And he thought about the fact that she counted when she was afraid, because it gave her something to hold. And that was the most specific and personal thing he knew about another human being. More specific and personal than anything he'd known about anyone in 40 years of living, and he sat with that in the bad chair, in the antiseptic corridor, and waited. The doctor came out at 43 minutes. Tae-jun was standing before the doors fully opened. The doctor was the OB Dr. Yoon, a small Korean-American woman in her mid-50s, who had the quality of someone who chose her words not for comfort, but for accuracy, which was the only quality Tae-jun wanted in a doctor at this moment. "She's stable," Dr. Yoon said. He exhaled. "The baby is stressed but responding. We have her on monitoring. Her blood pressure spiked significantly in the last hour. We're managing that now." She looked at him directly. "She went into early labor. We have stopped it for now." For now is the operative phrase. What does that mean? It means she is 32 weeks, and we would prefer to give this baby at least 4 more weeks inside before delivery. We're going to do everything in our capacity to make that happen, Doctor. Yoon's voice was measured. It also means that the level of physical and emotional stress she experienced today was significant. I understand there were circumstances. Yes, those circumstances cannot continue. They won't. The doctor looked at him for a moment, assessing in the way doctors assess, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "She's asking for you," Dr. Yoon said. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than she did anywhere else. That was the thing he always noticed, and always hated the way hospital beds had a flattening effect, the way they took the particularity out of a person and replaced it with the generic image of someone being managed by machinery. Amara was not being flattened by it. She was fighting it as she fought most things, by being entirely herself regardless of context. She had pushed herself up against the pillows, so she was partially upright. Her natural hair was loose around her head. She had what he'd come to recognize as her working expression and tensed, not afraid, but the face of a person whose mind is already 2 steps ahead of her body. She looked at him when he came in. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. "How bad was my reading in the car?" He came to the chair beside the bed. He sat, "Bad enough." "Give me the number." "I don't have the number. Cho has the number." Then asked Cho. He looked at her. You're stable. The baby is stressed but responding. Dr. Yoon stopped the labor. Amara absorbed that. He watched her absorb it the particular way. She processed difficult information, which was not to look away from it, but to look directly at it until it had finished being as bad as it was going to be, and then decide what to do next. 32 weeks, she said. Yes. 4 more would be better. That's what they're working toward. She looked at the monitor beside the bed. The baby's heartbeat was there faster than usual, slightly irregular, in the rhythm, but present. Counting. Doing the thing it needed to do. She put her hand on her stomach. I pushed too hard today, she said. He didn't answer. I knew my readings were elevated, and I went anyway. She looked at him. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know. I know you knew. I needed to be there. I know that too. She looked at him. Are you angry? He thought about that honestly. The way he'd been learning to be honest in this room instead of managed. I was afraid, he said in the car. I was afraid in a way that He stopped. No, I'm not angry. She held the counsel, she said. It's done, exactly as we planned. Song-ho is removed. The evidence is with federal contacts. She nodded slowly. Park Sung-dal's people will pull back when they understand the succession is secure, he said. Without Song-ho feeding them information, they lose their advantage. They'll recalculate. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. It's over, Amara. All of it. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Your uncle, she said. Yes. Are you all right? He looked at his hands. No, you will be. Maybe. She turned her head and looked at him, and her expression was the one she'd had in the library when she'd laid out the documents, not triumphant, not satisfied, just clear. The expression of a woman who sees things as they are and doesn't need them to be otherwise. He made a choice a long time ago, she said. That choice belongs to him. The grief you feel about it belongs to you. Those are 2 separate things. He looked at her. You can grieve someone who hurt you, she said. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. The monitor kept its count. 32 weeks, he said. 4 more. She turned back to the ceiling. 4 more, she agreed. They sat in the room together, in the particular quiet of people who have run as far as they can run and have arrived, finally at the place where the running stops and the real work begins. She stayed at Hudson Meridian for 9 days. 9 days during which Tae-jun came every morning before 8 and left after midnight and slept in the chair beside her bed in the way of a man who had decided the chair was perfectly adequate and would not be hearing otherwise. Mrs. Park brought food on the 3rd day, real food, from the estate kitchen, packed in containers with heating instructions in Mrs. Park's precise handwriting, because the hospital cafeteria, Amara had reported, was doing its best and its best was not enough. Denise came on the 4th day. She drove herself from Englewood in the old Buick she'd been driving for 11 years, parked in the hospital garage, came up to the room, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her niece in the hospital bed, with the monitors and the IV line, and Tae-jun and Tae-jun sitting in the corner working through documents on his laptop, and the whole complicated architecture of what their lives had become in the past year. Denise was 61 years old. She'd buried a husband. She'd kept a shop alive through things that should have killed it. She was not a person who fell apart easily. She sat down in the chair on the other side of Amara's bed and took her niece's hand and didn't say anything for a full 2 minutes. You look like your mother, Denise said finally. Amara looked at her. When she was pregnant with you, she had that same face. Denise shook her head. That I am handling this face. She had it the whole 9 months. Was she handling it? About as well as you are. Denise looked at the monitor. Then at Tae-jun in the corner. How are you holding up? It took Amara a moment to realize Denise was asking him. Tae-jun looked up from the laptop. The question had clearly surprised him, not the words, but the fact of being asked. The simple human act of someone wanting to know how he was. Managing, he said. Denise looked at him steadily. That's not what I asked. A pause. No, he said. I'm not fine, but I will be. Denise nodded, the way she nodded when someone had given her the real answers instead of the managed one. Good. She turned back to Amara. That's the right answer. Amara looked at her aunt. She thought about the night in the shop, when Denise had told her about the debt and the arrangement, the way Denise had sat, with her hands flat on the table, steadying herself. The weight she'd been carrying for years, without showing it. The debt that had accumulated while Amara was elsewhere grieving, and Denise was alone keeping everything alive. The shop, Amara said, don't. The shop is fine. Denise's voice was firm. The shop has been fine. You are not in a hospital bed worrying about the shop. Someone needs to tell me it's fine. Denise was quiet for a moment. Then it's fine, Amara, softer. It's always been fine. It's going to be fine. She squeezed her hand. That's not what you saved. You know that, right? Amara looked at her. You saved yourself, Denise said. That was the only thing I was ever actually worried about. Not the shop. She shook her head. Whether you'd find your way back to yourself after everything. She glanced at Tae-jun and then back. Looks like you did. The room was quiet. Tae-jun had closed the laptop. She delivered at 36 weeks and 2 days. Not the 4 extra weeks Dr. Yoon had wanted, but not 32 either. 36 weeks and 2 days, which Dr. Yoon said, with the particular precision of someone who had learned their victories, who had learned to find their victories' acceptable ranges rather than ideal ones, was a good outcome. A genuinely good outcome. The labor was 18 hours. Tae-jun was present for all of it, which was either a testament to his commitment or to the fact that nobody had managed to locate a reasonable moment to suggest he leave, and he was not the kind of man you suggested things to without a good reason. He was present for the hours that were manageable and the hours that were not. He was present for the point, somewhere around hour 12, when Amara stopped being polite about the pain, when she dropped the composed, controlled version of herself entirely and became simply a person in tremendous physical difficulty, seen, which was the most unguarded he had ever seen her, and which he had not expected to be the most frightening and most humbling thing he'd ever witnessed in one simultaneous experience. She gripped his hand at one point with a force that had nothing restrained or careful about it. He did not move. He sat with his hand in hers and he thought, she is made of something I do not have a word for. Not strength exactly, something more specific. The capacity to be in the worst part of something and not leave. To stay. He had spent his entire life believing that the most powerful people were the ones who could remove themselves from situations that threatened to break them. He was watching someone become powerful by refusing to remove herself. At hour 16, Dr. Yoon's expression changed in a way that made Tae-jun's chest go cold, and the next 20 minutes were the longest of his life monitoring equipment, a second physician, consultations happening in clipped medical language that he mostly understood and entirely hated. And then the room reconfigured itself. And then there was a sound. Small, indignant, absolutely insistent, the sound of a person who has just arrived somewhere and has immediate complaints about the conditions. Tae-jun stood. The nurse moved toward him with something wrapped in a blanket that was still the impossible size of something that hadn't existed 2 minutes ago in any way he could hold, and she put it in his arms, and he looked down. His daughter looked back at him. She was red-faced and furious, and her eyes were barely open, and she had a remarkable amount of hair for someone who had been alive for 30 seconds, and she was the smallest complete person he had ever seen. And she looked at him with the unfocused, absolute gaze of someone who had not yet learned to pretend. And something happened in his chest that he did not have any architecture for. Everything he had built, the organization, the estate, the careful walls, the cultivated distance felt in this specific moment like scaffolding. Like the structure you put up around the building you're actually constructing. Necessary for the process, not the thing itself. This was the thing itself. He was crying before he knew he was going to. Not quietly. Not controlled. The kind that came from somewhere you'd sealed off so long you'd forgotten the seal existed. He looked up at Amara. She was watching him. Exhausted, wrung out, her hair loose, and her face carrying 18 hours of work, and still with that clear, direct gaze that saw everything. Hi, she said. Quiet, like they were the only people in the room. He crossed to her. He held their daughter in one arm, and with his free hand, he touched Amara's face, forehead, cheek, the line of her jaw like a man verifying something his eyes couldn't fully convince him of. Hi, he said. She leaned into his hand. Their daughter made a small sound between them. They both looked down. She's loud, Amara said. She is. His voice was wrecked. He didn't care. She gets that from you. Amara made a sound that was too tired to be a laugh, but was clearly attempting to be one. She's been inside me for 9 months. She gets everything from me right now. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He shifted so Amara could see their daughter's face. They sat like that for a while, the three of them, in the room that smelled like antiseptic and industrial floor wax, under fluorescent lights that were not the lights either of them would have chosen for this moment, and it did not matter at all. They named her Amara Ellison Kang. Nari had been Tae-jun's suggestion, offered quietly one evening during the hospital stay, before the labor. During one of the nights when Amara was awake at 2 in the morning, because sleep was increasingly impossible, and Tae-jun was in the chair because he was always in the chair. It means lily in Korean, he said. My mother paused. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother unprompted in all the months Amara had known him. She planted them in the garden of the house I grew up in. Before my father took over the organization, when things were different. Amara looked at him in the dark. She would have liked you, he said. Simply, she was quiet for a moment. What was she like? Loud, he said. Very direct. She told people exactly what she thought, and she was right about most of it, and she knew she was right, which made her difficult to argue with. He paused. She made the kitchen into the room that mattered in the house. Everything else was furniture. Amara thought about that. Nari, she said. Yes, Amara Ellison Kang. He looked at her. My name comes first, she said. She came out of my body. Ellison comes first. He noddedly. Ellison Kang. Good. She put her hand on her stomach. Amara Ellison Kang, she said again. Feeling the weight of it. That's a name she can carry. Song-ho's case moved through federal channels with the particular grinding patience of institutions that are thorough, because they understand that a case built carefully is a case that holds. Tae-jun had given the federal investigators everything, the payment records, the correspondence with Dr. Lim, the documentation of the pregnancy leak, and its recipients, the shell company trails. He had done this with Cho present and his attorney present, and with the full understanding of what it meant to hand documents to federal investigators when you ran an organization that had not historically operated on the correct side of most regulatory frameworks. It was a calculation, a deliberate one. The evidence against Seong-ho was specific and prosecutable financial fraud, conspiracy, the deliberate leakage of protected medical information. Tae-jun's cooperation in that case, his attorney had negotiated, came with a framework. He was not confessing to his own organization's operations. He was providing evidence of crimes committed against him and his family. It was a line, not a clean one, but a line. Seong-ho's attorney attempted, in the weeks that followed, 3 separate counter-narratives. None of them landed. The documents were too specific. The payment records too clearly traced. Dr. Lim, faced with his own exposure, cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The letter, the assessment, has been delivered as discussed. The framing emphasizes permanence was admitted into evidence. The subject had his own opinion about permanence now. Tae-jun did not attend any of the proceedings. He received updates from his attorney, read them, filed them, and did not discuss them at home unless Amara asked. She asked twice. Both times he answered fully and then closed the subject. The grief was there. He wasn't pretending it wasn't. Seong-ho had stood beside him at his father's funeral, had taught him to drive, had sat across from him in 100 difficult rooms, and given him counsel that Tae-jun had trusted completely, because it came from the mouth of someone he'd loved. The counsel had been good, sometimes. That was the specific cruelty of it, the genuine advice mixed with the engineered limitation, so that you couldn't separate what was real from what was designed. 30 years of a relationship, and somewhere inside it, like a slow leak in a wall, the rot that had been there since the beginning. He sat with it. He did not let it become the only thing. Nari came home to the estate when she was 11 days old. She was small enough to carry in one arm, which Tae-jun did constantly, and with the focused care of a man who had applied the highest level of his operational attention to the project of not dropping his daughter. He had studied swaddling from 3 separate sources and practiced on a rolled blanket before Nari arrived, a fact that Amara discovered when Mrs. Park mentioned it, with the carefully neutral expression of someone trying not to find it endearing. The house changed. It changed the way houses change, when they stop being organized around absence and start being organized around presence. There were bottles on the counter of the kitchen that had once held nothing but sparkling water. There was a swing in the sitting room that played a soft, repeating melody. There were muslin cloths on every flat surface because Nari had opinions about her stomach contents that she expressed frequently and without warning. Tae-jun's desk had a baby monitor on it. He checked it constantly. He checked it the way he had once checked his phone during high-stakes negotiations, with the same frequency, the same involuntary pull toward the screen. Amara pointed this out one evening, and he looked at the monitor and then at her and said, with complete seriousness, the negotiations were less important. She looked at him. The negotiations were less important, he said again. As a simple fact, she picked up her tea. You're going to be a ridiculous father, she said. He looked at Nari in the swing. Yes, he said, like she'd told him something he already knew and was fine with. 3 months after Nari came home, Tae-jun told Amara what he was doing with the organization. He told her in the kitchen, at the table where they had eaten together since the 3rd day of their marriage, over a dinner she had made, and he had eaten with the same quiet attention he had given every meal since the first Sunday she'd cooked in this house. He had been moving toward the decision for months. She had seen it, not the specifics, but the shape of it, in the way his meetings shifted, the people he was meeting with, the legal and financial consultants who were appearing in his schedule with increasing frequency. She had not asked, because she'd understood that this was a thing he was working out for himself, and asking too early would only interrupt the working. Now, he told her, he was not dismantling the organization overnight. It wasn't possible, and it wouldn't be honest to say otherwise. A sound like Green Woods he'd managed had depth and complexity and dependencies that couldn't be severed in a single motion without consequences for people who hadn't made the choices he'd made. But he was building exits, security legitimate, using the networks and expertise that were genuinely his. Logistics and property, the legal side of what the organization had always done anyway, stripped of what it was covering for. Import and distribution, properly licensed, properly taxed, operated in the open. The criminal operations would not be replaced. They would be left behind. Slowly, deliberately, with the understanding that leaving them behind required building something substantial enough to step onto. He was building it. How long, Amara said. Years, he said. Honestly, it won't be clean or fast. I'm not going to tell you it will be. She looked at him. But Nari, he stopped. I am not handing her this. His voice was very steady. Whatever I pass to her, it will not be this. Amara looked at her hands around her mug. She thought about her father, who had never had much in the way of money or organization or power, and who had left her exactly 2 things, the way he whistled while he cooked, and the instruction to work with the grain. She had been living on both of those for 3 years. What you left a person mattered, not just the substance of it, the nature of it. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her. Nothing you haven't already given, he said. She looked up. You showed me what a house is supposed to feel like, he said. You showed me what it costs to stay in a hard room. And you found the thing that would have destroyed our daughter's future before she was even born. He held her gaze. I'm not building toward anything I hadn't already decided I wanted. I just understand now what wanting it actually means. She was quiet for a moment. Denise's shop, she said. Already cleared. Completely she knows. Amara looked at him. When? The week Nari was born. I should have done it sooner. He paused. I did it then. She set her mug. She pressed her lips together for a moment, looking at the table, and when she looked back up, her eyes were bright, but her face was steady in the way her face was always steady. I'm going to reopen my own work, she said. Not just Denise's shop. My own studio. There's a space in Englewood I've had my eye on. I know, he said. She looked at him. You mentioned it twice in the hospital, he said. Once to Denise and once when you thought I was asleep. A slight pause. I wasn't asleep. Were you ever asleep in that chair? Occasionally. She looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, the thing she'd been managing since the beginning, the careful distance she'd maintained between what she felt and what she named, coming a little closer to the surface. Tae-jun, she said, yes, what are we? The question sat between them. He didn't look away from it. He didn't reach for a managed answer. He sat with it the way he'd learned, to sit with things that mattered not at arm's length, but fully in, whatever it cost. We're whatever you want to call it, he said. I know what it is for me. What is it? He looked at her. You came into my house as payment for a debt, he said, and you opened every curtain in it. You cooked in a kitchen that nobody had cooked in for years. You told me that fear gets you obedience but not loyalty, and you were right, and I knew you were right. The moment you said it, even though it took me 2 hours to admit it. He looked at his hands and then back at her. You sat in a locked room and counted to 11 minutes and 23 seconds so that 4 people wouldn't fall apart. You found a 15-year conspiracy in a box of old letters because you cataloged things other people thought were finished. Not like green wood, splitting, and you were in a hospital bed with a blood pressure monitor on your arm, and you were still thinking about the sequence of the documents. He paused. I have never known anyone like you, he said. I didn't know a person like you was a thing that existed. A beat. And I'm not a man who says things like this. I don't have the he stopped. I love you. That's the word. It's not large enough, but it's the one there is. The kitchen was quiet. Nari was asleep in the sitting room. The baby monitor on the counter showed her breathing small, steady, regular. Amara looked at Tae-jun across the kitchen table. At the gray tie he'd stopped wearing since the council meeting. At his hands, which she had watched chop 100 onions badly, and then better, and then well. At his face, which she had read like a language for the past year, until she understood every variation of its silence. I know it's not large enough, she said. It's still the right word. She reached across the table. He met her halfway. Their hands on the table, between tea mugs, the dinner plates, and the baby monitor counting their daughter's breath. The studio opened the following spring. Ellison Restoration Amara's name. Ellison of a space in Amara's name that had good light and high ceilings and room for the kind of work she'd always wanted to do without the constraints of Denise's smaller shop. She kept Denise's shop going too. They ran them in parallel, different enough in scale that they didn't compete, connected enough that they shared resources and referrals. The work was the same work it had always been, finding the thing that was broken and understanding why, and deciding whether what was underneath was worth bringing back. Sometimes it wasn't. Most of the time it was, if you were willing to be patient and precise. She was good at patient and precise. The studio became known for furniture that other restorers had declined the pieces, with extensive damage, unusual construction, problems that required more time than most shops could justify. Amara justified it. She had a small team by the second year, 2 people she'd trained herself, and she was particular about the work they took, and more particular about the work they turned down. Tae-jun came to see it the week it opened. He stood in the middle of the main workroom with his hands in his pockets and looked at the space, the tools hanging on the wall in her order, the daylight lamps, the reference books on the long shelf, the smell of linseed oil and wood stain, and something underneath that was just the smell of old wood being carefully handled. He looked at everything. You built this, he said. We rent it, she said from the workbench, where she was going through an intake assessment. You built this, he said again. Not corrected, just certain. She looked up at him. He was smiling, not almost smiling. Not the facial arrangement adjacent to smiling that she'd cataloged in the first months. Actually, genuinely smiling, the full version which she had learned, was rare enough that you noticed it every time, which meant it never lost its specific weight. She looked at him smiling in the middle of her studio, and she thought, here is a man who spent 40 years learning to protect himself from the cost of wanting things. Here's a man who paid the cost anyway. Stop looking at me like that, she said. I'm trying to assess this, Chippendale, and you're distracting me. I'm not doing anything. You're doing the smile. I'm allowed to smile, not while I'm working. He came over and looked at the Chippendale piece on the workbench. It was a side chair, mid-18th century, if her initial assessment was right, Significant water damage to the back splat, and one leg replaced badly at some point in the last 100 years with the wrong wood. Can it be saved? He said. She looked at it, ran her thumb along the grain of the original leg. Yes, she said. You just have to understand what it was before you can figure out what to bring it back to. He looked at her. She felt him looking at her and did not look up. Work with the grain, she said. What? Something my father used to say. She set down her notes. Don't fight the material. Understand it. Then work with it. He was quiet for a moment. That sounds like more than furniture advice, he said. It's always been more than furniture advice. She picked up her assessment form. He was a wise man. Tae-jun looked at the Chippendale chair. He put his hand on the original leg, next to where hers had been. He stopped. He would have liked you, she said, before he could finish. I know, he looked at her. You're going to say I don't know that, she said. But I know my father, and I know you. She wrote something on the form. He would have liked you. The morning light was coming through the high windows of the studio and hitting the workbench at the angle that made everything on it look like it mattered. Which it did, which everything in this room did in its specific, imperfect way. That evening, back at the estate, Denise stayed for dinner. She did this increasingly drove over from Englewood, sat at the table that had once been silent and was now, almost always, something else. Mrs. Park had given up being startled by the things that appeared in her kitchen and had started, Amara suspected, quietly requesting them. There was a high chair at the table. Nari, 5 months old, occupied it with the particular authority of a person who understood that she was the reason for most things, without quite grasping what that meant. She had her father's eyes and her mother's hair and an opinion about almost everything she encountered that she expressed without hesitation and without apology. She was by general consensus a great deal. Tae-jun fed her from a small bowl of pureed sweet potato. He did this with the concentrated attention he brought to everything, monitoring her face for signs of preference or rejection, adjusting the angle of the spoon, keeping a cloth nearby that he used with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned, as he had learned everything in the past year, by paying attention and doing the work. Denise watched him feed Nari across the table. Then she looked at Amara. Amara looked back at her. Denise had the expression of someone who is deciding whether to say the thing she's thinking or simply allow the thing she's thinking to exist in the room without being named. She decided to allow it. She picked up her fork. The table was loud and warm and full, in the way that tables are full when the people around them have decided, consciously or not, that this is where they belong. Mrs. Park came in with a second round of cornbread. She had learned to make it herself, from Amara's recipe early in the year, and had taken to it with the specific pride of someone who has added something real to their repertoire. Nari made a sound at the cornbread. She knows, Denise said. She's 5 months old, Amara said. She knows, Denise said again. Firmly. Tae-jun looked at his daughter's face, then at the cornbread, then back at Nari, who was making her feelings about the situation clear. In the wordless, absolute, she made all her feelings clear. She knows, he agreed. Amara looked at the two of them. You're both ridiculous, she said. She reached for the cornbread. The evening moved the way. Evenings moved in this house, now slow and overlapping. Conversation drifting between topics without urgency. Nari's commentary threading through everything. The particular sound of people who have found the place where they are most themselves and are not in a hurry to be anywhere else. Later, after Denise had gone and Mrs. Park had gone, and Nari was in her room under the monitor's patient watch, Amara stood on the terrace that looked out over the Hudson. The river was dark and moving, the way it always was, carrying everything it carried without comment. She heard Tae-jun come out behind her. He stood beside her. Not touching, just present in the immediate space, the way he had stood beside her in the library, when he'd needed to not be alone in something, and she had understood without being told. They thought I needed to marry, he said, because they needed me to have an heir. She looked at the river. I know, she said. He was quiet for a moment. They were looking at the wrong thing, he said. An heir was never what I needed. He turned and looked at her profile, her face in the light from the house, her hair loose the way she wore it in the evenings. the particular stillness of a person who was comfortable in their own body in a way that had taken her a long time to get back, and that he had watched her get back, piece by piece, over the year. "You gave me a family," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was not looking at the river. He was looking at her. The way he had learned to look at things he valued, not possessively, not with the intensity of ownership, but specific, steady attention of a man who has finally stopped, pretending he doesn't need what he needs. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. He closed his eyes. The river moved past them in the dark, indifferent and constant, carrying everything forward, the way it always had the weight of what had happened and the fact of what was, and somewhere downstream, the open water of what came next. She kept her hand against his face. She felt him breathe. They stood on the terrace of the house that had been a museum and then a residence, and then, through the accumulated work of ordinary days and extraordinary ones, become them that neither of them had known to ask for, because neither of them had believed it was still available to people like them. Inside, Amara Ellison Kang slept in the house that was hers. Outside, her parents stood at the edge of the dark and did not need to say anything else.